Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Paul Hammer. I'm a psychiatrist. And today, I'd like to talk to you about the healing power of compassion. I want to tell you a story about how I came to deeply understand this phenomenon. What I want to talk about is how, in a moment of stress, of traumatic stress, compassion can affect how we experience, perceive, and possibly avoid a traumatic stress injury. I want to tell you a story about a surgeon and a corpsman. This is Fallujah, November and December of 2004, during one of the most intense battles of that war. I happened to be there as one of the psychiatrists there, and during a lull in the battle, I witnessed something remarkable. A Humvee, much like this one, rolled up with a corpsman and 3 Marines. 2 of the Marines were fairly seriously injured, but not fatally. But the third one was seriously injured. And the surgical team immediately leapt into action, swept him into the operating room, and began to go to work on him. Meanwhile, the corpsman, having done his job, took off his helmet, unfastened his flak jacket, put his rifle down, and was able to breathe easy, finally, having done his job, and brought his Marines to Bravo Surgical Company. It wasn't too long before the surgeon came out of the OR, went up to the corpsman, and told him that the Marine that he had tried so hard to save had not survived. He died. The corpsman at that point had his helmet in his hand, and he was talking to us, and you could see him become enraged, and he just wound up as hard as he could and just slammed his helmet to the ground. At that point, the surgeon did something remarkable. He grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, which was the collar of his flak jacket, and started him marching out the door of the triage entrance, which is right there, into that parking lot that you see, which was huge. And they made laps around the parking lot, lap after lap after lap. And you could see and occasionally hear as they came by, as they talked about what they had experienced. The surgeon talked about how the round had entered in a gap in the flak jacket, almost impossibly, how it had gone into his chest, the vital organs that were injured, the amount of blood that was lost. He even described for the corpsman how remarkable it was that he was able to get a patent IV inserted into this guy, given the amount of blood loss he had. It took about 45 minutes, but you could see through the body language and the gestures and the way the conversation was going that the corpsman started to visibly relax. The tense anger and frustration was starting to be relieved. And after about 45 minutes of pacing and doing lap after lap after lap around that parking lot, they came back. Corpsman wiped away the tears from his face, put on his flak jacket, put his helmet back on, fastened up the flak jacket, gathered up his rifle, and went back out to the battle to be with his Marines. You see, what happened there was interesting. The corpsman thought that he had failed because his Marine didn't survive. And what I think was important at that particular moment was that if the surgeon had not corrected that misperception, had not helped him understand what really happened at that moment, it would have become solidified in his mind as his truth, and something that could potentially haunt him later as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That troubling perception, that little piece of the puzzle, that violation of what we think is right, is called a moral injury. This is an interesting phenomenon that was written about by one of my colleagues, Bill Nash, who was also there at the same time. A lot of us were puzzled about the fact that even after people had come home and you were able to treat them and do a lot of things, they still felt guilty, they still felt bad. He built upon the work of Jonathan Shea, who worked with Vietnam veterans in the previous wars. Jonathan Shea wrote 2 books which are interesting. One is called Achilles in Vietnam, and the other one is Odysseus in America, where he talked about the difficulty with Vietnam veterans in reconciling what they believed to be right, or these violations of, or spiritual injuries that he coined the term moral injury. The National Center for PTSD describes it, or defines it, as distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to traumatic events or unusually stressful circumstances that occurs where people may perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness events that contradict deeply held moral or spiritual beliefs or expectations. Most people are aware of what PTSD is and what the concept of psychological trauma is all about. They're aware that there are consequences to experiencing and witnessing the horrible events of war. But there's a deeper level of spiritual wounding that occurs with killing another human being, witnessing or committing atrocities, feeling betrayed by leadership, or even more subtle events such as the stress of having to make decisions that affect the lives of your people when only bad options are available. In the case of our friend the corpsman, his potential moral injury was his own unrealistic expectations that he would be able to do the impossible and that he could save this Marine from such a catastrophic injury. Here's the thing that's relevant to us, though. I don't think this concept of spiritual or moral injury is only about severe psychological trauma. Accidents, assaults, torture, combat, killing, horrific injuries. I think that this can come about with the little traumas and the little things that occur to us in everyday life. The little injuries that we inflict on ourselves and on each other that pile up every day by day, week by week, moment by moment. And as I've seen now, in this day and age, in 2021, with COVID and the pandemic, with arguments over politics, with civil strife, with all of the anger and frustration that's out there in the world right now, I've seen a lot of this in many of my patients. These little spiritual injuries that appear to be building up. And there's an interesting phenomena at work here. I often tell my patients that when you're in it, you can't see it. When we're in stressful situations or we're engrossed in something or really deeply into something, we often aren't aware of our own reactions. Have you ever talked to somebody who's angry, and as you're talking to them say, "Why are you so angry?" And they come back at you saying, "I'm not angry." Clearly they are. They're not aware of it. How about talking to a teenager in love with somebody that may not be good for them? Or ever try to talk somebody out of a really stupid, great idea? They're so invested in their own thing that they can't step back and, again, see the forest for the trees. Often in those stressful moments, when we're engaged with somebody, and particularly when they're stressful or really intense, we freeze. We're unsure of what to say or do. We often react then out of our own insecurities, our own needs, our own blind spots. What do we want? What's our agenda? And we fail to see the pain that's going on in other people. That's why that surgeon's actions were so remarkable. He didn't think about his own frustration his own pain, his own difficulty about losing a patient on the operating room table. He saw the emotional pain in a young man who really wasn't processing this correctly, and he immediately acted to relieve it. I want to tell you another story. This is my medical school, Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Think of it as West Point, Naval Academy, Air Force Academy for medical school. A former Surgeon General of the Israeli Defense Force was a visiting professor when I was a student there. And our medical ethics professor asked him to come and speak at our medical ethics class. And during the time that we were in the class, we were covering the issue of dual roles. That is, what do you do when you're wearing two different hats, and what's the ethical thing to do? In our case, we were wrestling with how do we reconcile being a military officer and a physician at the same time. So we invited this former Israeli Surgeon General to our class, and they had a question and answer period. At one point, our professor was doing a sort of question and answer thing, and he talked to him and he said, let me pose a hypothetical situation. What would you do if you're the physician at an aid station, and into your aid station comes two wounded people? One is a Palestinian and the other is an Israeli soldier, and they both have exactly the same wounds. Who do you triage first? And he said to the professor, looking at him in kind of an interesting way, that's a stupid question and I'm not going to answer it. But what he said next has stuck with me to this day. He said, what I will tell you is this. Always remember this. First, you're a human being. Second, you're a physician. And last, you're a military officer. I've never forgotten that, even though it happened. That class occurred over 30 years ago. And I think about that every time I think about what that surgeon did with that corpsman. The reason is that when he took that young corpsman by the scruff of his neck and was going to correct him on what he was doing and what he was thinking and marched him around the parking lot, that was done out of an abundance of love, brotherhood, and affection. He reached out with compassion as a human being, one to another, sharing the common pain of frustration, loss of a patient, failure, all of that. And what I'm here to tell you today is that when done correctly, that kind of compassionate outreach, particularly in a moment of traumatic stress, is magical. It is a magically therapeutic thing that in that particular instance was far more therapeutic than anything I could have done as a psychiatrist doing therapy or critical incident stress debriefing or anything else in that moment. It was their bond. It was their patient. They shared it. And by doing that with him, I think it was enormously effective, far more than any therapy or any other medication or anything I could have done. It beats psychotherapy and serotonin medications by a mile. So I want to ask you, in this time of ours that we live in now, this time of pandemic, of pain, of division, of strife, of anger, who do you know that's hurting right now? Who do you know who could use some love, some friendship, a listening ear, a helping hand? Who do you know who could use some compassion? And who do you know might need some healing? Here's the big bonus for this. When you reach out in a genuine act of compassion, not only does this help your friend, your spouse, your brother, your sister, your parents, your children, your neighbor. It also helps and heals a part of your own injured humanity, that part that's being nibbled to death by ducks in this day and age. To quote the famous prayer of St. Francis, where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. And where there's sadness, joy. And if I could be so bold, I'd like to add another of my own. Where there's pain, let us sow compassion and healing. Thank you.